going gradeless at the beginning of the school year. We've talked about a bunch of different topics already. Last week, we were talking about teaching kids to track their own progress. And this week, we're going to be talking about the equity piece of assessment, how we really assess the whole child, honoring their dignity and really treating them with the most amount of respect that we could possibly be giving them, because this learning is such a personal thing and everybody does it so differently that to have some, streamlined one way to do it seems to do a disservice to all the kids that we work with. So Isaac, I'm going to ask you first, what are some of the ways that you really have worked either with teachers or in your own classroom to ensure that student voices are a part of the assessment process, and how do you honor those voices?
I think one of the key moves we can make is right up front when we begin with the work and we're defining those criteria, is to begin with co-construction of success criteria. And that's one of those terms that sounds more complicated than it is, but I do it, with 5-year-olds who are brand new to school. And by I mean the many amazing people I get to work with now do it. So it can be as simple as saying, here is a drawing of me and my family in my apartment, or here is a drawing of my favorite, whatever we're talking about. And then having a discussion about, okay, what helps us understand this drawing? What can we do better? And through that, when the kids do that the first couple of times, like if I do this for the first time in a 5th grade classroom, it's often harder than it is with the younger kids because they're used to being told what is good and they're used to being evaluated from the outside. But even that, within 10, 15 minutes, they make that change because we naturally have opinions. And this is a long answer, but I think the trick is to schedule it, to say this is part of what we do. Having you co-construct these success criteria is just as important as having you create products on your own or do a performance. And over time, the kids realize they have that input, and they realize that we as educators are not all-knowing somehow. I've been in sessions even with kids who are 5 and 6 years old rather, who have brought something up, and I've been like, oh, right. Let's talk about that. Let's add that. Because, you always have your criteria ahead, you're kind of working toward. But when we're open to that, and when we're open to true criticism of our work, as a 4th grade teacher in North Carolina, we were the writing grade, which I loved because I love to teach writing and I love writing. But that also meant I would do a lot of samples that I would share out, and I had to be open to these wonderful 10-year-olds who would be like, nope. And you look back and think, we're talking about character development. This is a very flat character. So that's a long answer to say, but I think if we just say in our schedule, this is time to get kids involved and to hear them, it happens. If we just say, we'll accept it when it comes, it'll never happen.
I think on the other end, something you said, Isaac, really resonated with me in terms of students really expecting teachers to be their sole audience. And even in the 12th grade, when I was working with students, sometimes what I had to say about their work seemed like the most important thing. So shifting the mindset that their voices don't matter as much as mine or their other teachers did was a really big part of that, which is why reflection became such a big part of the work that we were doing together. And that was the first step I really started taking when I recognized that maybe I wasn't clear enough. And I know that I've spoken about that before, like using really structured reflections gave me an opportunity to really see what students thought they were supposed to be doing, how well they thought they did against the standards, how well they felt they were doing in a lot of different ways. And it gave me the opportunity to honor their learning by acknowledging the stuff that they were working on, their specific goals. It also gave me the opportunity to give them the feedback they were requesting. And I think that that is such an important part of, when a student really trusts you and they give you that information, to ignore it or to continue on your own agenda is really not something that is going to make them feel like they want to open up more to you.
Right.
And that goes with teachers too. I mean, think about either when you're working with teacher teams or when I was working with individual teachers for observations, when we'd have our pre-observation conversation, I would ask them, what do you want me to look for while I'm watching your lesson? What do you need feedback on? Asking those questions and truly inviting their answers and honoring it so that when we come back to have that conversation afterwards, I had the data they asked me to look for, and we were able to look at really constructive strategies to support the things they felt they needed to work on, instead of me going in there with an agenda that felt like a gotcha when they didn't meet the specific needs that I never told them about. And that kind of circles back around to what you were suggesting earlier, Isaac, with the co-construction of success criteria. If we do that together, everybody in the space knows what the expectations are, which I think is another way of really honoring a person's dignity when you're assessing them, giving them an opportunity to have input about what success looks like and how that is going to impact them as a learner moving forward.
Yeah, it's hard to forget how to do something well if you help decide how to do it well.
Exactly.
And I kind of laughed. I actually LOL'd, which I don't think ever really happens. But when you said the thing about like catching them doing something you never told them to do, and it was one of those understanding laughs because I've done that so many times, especially in my first years of teaching, because I didn't understand my role. I honestly thought my role was to grade humans, to say like, this is where you are in this. And I use progressions and things which were, there's some positives to it. But when I look back, I was seeing it as like, this is where you are. So I'm going to tell you that, instead of you're here because your teacher has not engaged you in this. And you have you're just starting whatever grade this is with me. You have no idea what the expectations are. Sure, I showed you one example and talked to you about it, but I'm not even clear until I read yours. And so many conferences were that like, no, you need to do this. And they were so polite that they didn't say like, well, why didn't you tell me that? Or why isn't that in your example? But hearing you say it that plainly brought back a lot of memories, fond memories of kids I love, but I wish I'd done better.
And you know what? I think that that's so true. And I think back to like year 0 to 5 in teaching and how many times, like even when I was grading grading essays, let's start with that, like going back to my early career when I was not really even using rubrics effectively. And again, I know we've talked about this before. I don't even know how sold I am on using rubrics for everything, because most of the times rubrics really do fall short in terms of individual student needs, which is why the single point rubric works a little better, because it's concrete, or using a progression is also a little bit better than a rubric, because then it's not just, did I follow it to the letter? I also don't understand why people put 1s and 2s on rubrics, because we don't want kids to be shooting for 1s and 2s. We want them to be shooting for proficiency or mastery. So that's why the single point rubric, to me, I think works a lot more effectively than, telling them all the things they're not doing in a 1 or a 2. And that's why they're there. I think we should be focusing for what they need and then identifying the deficiencies together and really putting an action plan in place to get them to proficiency instead. But I made so many mistakes in those early years. I kind of feel badly. I still do too, but different ones. They certainly aren't the, I'm grading a pile of papers. The ones I started with either got a really strict Miss Sackstein reading it, or on the other side, not. And by the time I got to the end of the pile, I'm midway through a bottle of wine with one of my friends. We're all very depressed about what wasn't coming back. And I think at the time, I didn't realize the reason that things weren't improving was that I had not explicitly taught or shared that those were the things I was looking for. In those days too, I would do examples with them, and I would do it for the same thing they had to do, and then they would just copy my example. It took me a few times to realize that that wasn't the most effective way to get them to start thinking for themselves in that way.
It flips everything around. Instead of them doing the work and working through that progression, we're trying to save it on the back end. And even with 30 or so students, that becomes impossible. But especially in middle school, high school, you've got 150 or whatever it might be, there's no way you can fix it all on the back end, because there's just too many things to hit. So then you're trying to decide, what do we really focus on? I was thinking still about what you said about the rubrics, and we're not trying to set our goal at a 1. And Paul Bloomberg, something he's been doing lately is rephrasing even the idea of prerequisites and things like that as setting the stage, which is such a positive way to look and see if we're doing a quick pre-assessment, or as we're building some of these basic skills. This is not because you're unable or not ready or something like that. It's because, or not capable. It's because you're just not ready. We haven't taught you these few things. And so that becomes some of those skills that would be like a 1 or a red or a whatever. But then when you see it as skills that need to be developed, that's back on us. How do I create an opportunity for you to either show you can already do this, and you just didn't show up before, or to develop this skill? So I've adopted that now, that idea of like, we're setting the stage, and then we're working through these, and then we're able to go deeper and transfer.
I think
with a positive bit on
one
it.
of the things that's really troubling, and I can't say this enough to anybody who's watching right now, we simply can't assess things we haven't taught. Unless we explicitly told students that this is what the expectations are and this is what I'm looking for, we cannot then take points off later for things we never told them we were looking for. So I know that when I'm doing an EAA team meeting with a team, for example, from impact teams, and we develop a formative task, and we develop success criteria for that formative task, and we determine that we're looking for one portion of something because we're focusing on a specific skill. You simply cannot take the time to then go back through, and English teachers are probably the worst with this. If you're focusing on a big thing like development, or you're looking at organization, stop correcting their grammar, stop trying to fix periods and reorganizing different things. Like it sends a really bad mixed signal to kids about what we're trying to do. And the same way you don't want a gotcha, you can't do it to kids either. We really have to make sure that when we make a commitment to assess a particular skill or content area, we are doing exactly what we say we're doing. And we're not going outside of that. And this is where it gets really tricky with points too. With if you are a teacher who uses points in any way, I would advocate to stop doing that if you are, because point systems really do hurt kids. I think that if you're gonna be assessing on a progression, then you really want to make sure that they know the progression ahead of time, they know the language, they know the skill, and that they know the end goal is mastery. And you might not get it, you likely won't get it on the first or second try unless you're already there to begin with. But that we're all, as learners, going on this journey, and in that journey, it's going to take multiple revisions, and it's going to you're going to try different strategies. And I'm not going to actually give you a final summative assessment on something until you've had multiple opportunities to practice, so that we can all honor each other as learners, and that it takes all of us a different amount of time to get there.
That's so powerful. And just you've said, I think every time you've talked about something, you brought up that idea of progressions, that if the students or the learners or we as learners know the progression, And then I heard too that focus, and that kind
Yeah.
of makes me think of the C4VTL, the overarching goals, or the
Mhm.
essential questions that are for a unit or even for a year. And it even made me think back to when you said at the very beginning that piece about student voice. Like, if that is one of our overarching goals for a year, that we are together to develop your voice as an author so you can remember ideas for yourself and share ideas for others and write to clarify your own thinking. And we keep bringing it back to that. It does take a bit of a load off, because yes, how to use a semicolon is important. But in the greater scheme of things, for most of the writing and thinking people are going to do, what's more important is that they feel confident to share that idea.
Right.
And as we look, like, we're on social media right now, and for years we've been talking about this crisis of understanding and division. But what if we're developing your ability to read into what people are sharing and to express yourself? Because it did not become the great equalizer that we thought it might have 15, 20 years ago. What it did is, the more money and power you have, the more you get your voice out there. But
Yeah.
still, there's something to be said for the more coherent you are and the more focused you are, and the better you can get your ideas across. And look at things that do go viral, these little grassroots bits. I know I'm weaving away a little bit, but I'm kind of getting back to that moral purpose of, because you mentioned as writing teachers and as
Right.
lit teachers, why do we study great literature? Why do we try to become authors? It's
Well,
all about understanding ourselves and others.
and that's a great segue too for, like, if
Hmm.
we kind of the additional sort of situation with what we teach and how
Hmm.
we teach it. And if we acknowledge the fact that um, when we're thinking about equity and we're developing curricula around the folks that we have sitting in our spaces,
Hmm.
um, what we teach also has a part in understanding this whole child picture. Having culturally responsive literature, um, getting student input in the way they learn, um, how they best like to receive and give feedback to each other. These kinds of things, I think we've often taken for granted. And I think, that being said, we really have to make a commitment, and this is even more so on the high school end, where
Hmm.
kids do understand the things that we don't always give them credit for. And I know that when I was working with my 12th graders in particular in my AP class, a lot of times I invited them to help me design the actual assessments we would be using. I invited them to select which text they wanted to be reading, and I gave them a lot of leeway in developing their own goals and the pace that they wanted to set. And the real goal was to empower, to allow them to be empowered so that they could make decisions about, what kind of product they were going to produce to show what
Hmm.
they knew, and also flexibility in the topics. So we had these opportunities where we did group work in class, which was often around the content I needed to align with my syllabus for the College Board. But then when it came time for them to demonstrate their understanding, they really had a lot of flexibility to do that kind of work through their own lens. And then the reflection helped me assess it in a more holistic and thoughtful way. I guess Matt is the one jumping in here. I
Hmm.
always get
Hmm.
Facebook user. Welcome, Matt. It's so great to see you. And thank you again last week for your help. It was so great
Yeah,
to have you on.
I loved rewatching.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm reading what Matt has here, and he
Hmm.
says, we just had a big moment looking at music theory and how Euro white centric the curriculum is. And you know what? That's so true in so many English classes as well, where we're teaching the classics, and so many of the classics are written by white men,
Hmm.
and even white women, without really expanding the lens beyond maybe the 2 to 4 token African American authors that end up on every single curriculum just because, February is Black History Month.
Right.
We have to do better than that. We need to make sure that every month has multicultural perspectives in what we do in class, for sure.
I was recently reading an article about that, and I'm trying to find it, but I'm not having success. I did just share something else great on that topic, but in a previous life, I was a professional musician.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Back before the crash of 2008, when you could make money doing that. And then now again, nobody is. But one of my good friends, Brevin Hamden, who I got to play with, was really leading a discussion on this, and he is local to North Carolina, but an unbelievable person, but just unbelievable musician who kind of focused on Afro-Cuban music and joining that with other styles. But he shared, I hope he doesn't mind me saying this because he shared online, but that he had to retake a music appreciation course. And this guy is brilliant in general, but a brilliant musician and hardworking. And that really stuck out to me and got me interested in the conversations they were having, because it was very much because of his background and his choice of study in music. And essentially he was just told no when he would bring up, like, how could we bring this into it? How could we talk more about this? How can we study, because it was specific to harmony is what he's talking about.
Right.
And he's got a great ear. He writes music, he can sing, all this stuff. But his background in traditionally like Black music in the US South and then in Cuban music is a very different harmonic style than when we're studying this great other music that we should also study. It's not to say don't study Mozart, Bach, etc. But what a great example of an adult paying for higher education and being left out as a participant in that education, and even having to pay more, retake courses, because their deep understanding of a topic wasn't fitting the narrow definition in those courses. And I'm going to find it so I can link.
It's so funny. Like, we talk about music, and as you were speaking, I was thinking about my experience in high school. I sang in 3 different groups in my high school. I was in the regular chorus, I was in the show choir, I was in the concert chorale. And my music teacher, I think, went to great lengths to bring in different kinds of music. And I remember singing African chants, and I remember singing different pieces from in different languages from around the world. And at the time, I don't know that I appreciated, unfortunately, having grown up in a predominantly white, affluent neighborhood, really, I didn't really appreciate the length he went to share those different styles of music. And I think now, looking back on it, I have a deeper appreciation for how hard it must have been to get choral arrangements for some of the stuff that we were singing. And yes, we did traditional stuff in the show choir. There was, we were singing and dancing. So there were a lot of medleys, show tunes, and stuff like that. But the concert chorale was more traditional, sort of, walking around with our binders. We weren't even expected to memorize that music. We were just expected to read it. And as it was in, 8-part harmonies and a much smaller group, we weren't singing and dancing. We were just mostly a cappella. So it was just very different. And then chorus was really where the most variety was. And I think that that's true in our classes as well, in our English classes and social studies. What things we choose to focus on is another way that we could honor our kids, by knowing who our kids are first, and then making sure that they see representations of themselves in what's happening in our spaces.
And it's interesting, Matt,
Yep.
the video
I
I was just about to share is the same video. I was just like, I better check it before I share it again. And that's what, just shout out to my friend Brevin, who really made me stop and think about it, to be honest, for the first time. I had some similar issues in school, but I thought, well, this is like, I'm kind of on this outskirts. But as you said, as like a middle class white male, I'm never really on the outskirts, even though my taste was different. I
Mhm.
was able to relate to everything we were doing. And if you think about it, literally, I had the same hairstyle as all those guys. I look like a Bach or a Mozart with their wig on. But I love that Matt said this is his crusade for this year, is that he's going to make them aware of that music out there. And I have to say, I hope it's okay. I'm doing these little shout outs all of a sudden, but Dr. Robert Palmer and Jim Leatherwood were two of my band instructors, and they did do a great job of this. Like, I still have in my head right now this song, Bujarenge is Bujarenge. Like, it just had this great rhythm, and it taught me what 12/4 is for the first time. And I was like maybe 14, 15. But they did go into how this is gorgeous African music that has influenced all the music you listen to now.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, when we look at our history, it was essentially slave music. And
Yep.
so, like, that is an example of African slaves singing in French because, because of the system of the time. But it created this beautiful music that's lasted so long. But then we know this, we look at blues and jazz and rock, but what if we change that? And so I love how this discussion started with how we grade writing and think about people, and how became this discussion of like how we acknowledge people and acknowledge truths, as we've seen all day on the news now, that we deny so many of these things that have
Well,
been part of our
I
history.
was just gonna say, with that kind of to bring us back full circle as we're getting
Mm-hmm.
ready to wrap up, thinking, Matt had said, kids just don't know what they're missing out on. And I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
adults are the same way. I know as a literature teacher, part of my crusade was always to see what my students were reading on their own and
Mm.
make a concerted effort to pick it up myself. Even if it was not something that I would have normally picked up on my own. And it was another way for me to connect with them, to get an idea of what they enjoyed reading and how I could use that to connect it. And when I was teaching in the inner city at the very beginning of my career, just there was um, a lot of stuff that I wouldn't like, Sister Soldier and the book
Mm-hmm.
she wrote, and a bunch of books that I definitely would not have picked up on my own. I had the opportunity to really get a window into different things. And then, later with The Hate You Give and
Mm-hmm.
um, a bunch of others. We Monday's Not Home was another one we read, or two, maybe her name was Tuesday, I don't remember. But that's basically that's how you connect with kids. And I feel like the older I get, sometimes the harder it was to connect. I mean, when I started teaching, I was 23, and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of my students were very close to my age. So I knew I knew what they were doing because I had just done it not too long
Mm-hmm.
before. And, there was a lot of camaraderie because of the closeness of our age. And then the older I got, and when I became a parent, and when I switched schools, and the whole demographic of who I was teaching changed, finding ways to connect with them the older I got, and the older I continue to get, is always very important, because you need to have those cultural references that
Mm-hmm.
make sense to them, and you need to be able to honor the things that they're interested in and make your class relevant for kids. And you'll find
Mm-hmm.
that, as we're assessing and thinking about their strengths instead of their deficits, that's sort of really where we need to be with all of this, is that we're looking at kids from a lens of strength. We're looking at kids from an understanding that we're there to support their success and not to break them down. And I think traditional grading systems and traditional assessing systems focus on the opposite. They focus on what's wrong instead of what's right. And I think as we're wrapping up for today, we need to be thinking about how we're validating what kids are doing right. You have any final thoughts, Isaac? You're reading.
No, I think you nailed it. And I was just trying to add in this great article that you had highlighted, the one about how teachers are changing grading and how they're focusing on the human aspect of learning, and that these are all humans and they deserve equity. And I love that we got off on that kind of side trail, because it happened. Matt brought up a great point and it took us there, and it all connects so well.
Yeah, I love these Friday Q&As. I'm glad folks are really enjoying them, and we have a few weeks left before we stop for a while, but we certainly want to make sure we're addressing your issues, your concerns. Next week, we're going to be talking about pushback. That's everybody's concern when we change things that people have grown to love. And that's going to be Friday, September 18th at 11. The spreadsheet, the calendar with all the information already has a couple of documents on it. If you have any you want to add, we'd certainly love that. Or if you have specific questions you want us to address, just add them on as comments on the document. And just a small plug to end here that in March, I have my new book coming out, which is going to be called Assessing with Respect, which is all about the intersection between social emotional learning and assessment, and ways that teachers could honor students' dignity in class. All right, everyone. Thank you so much, Isaac. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
We'll
thanks for
see you
having me.